Sabina, a Jewish woman from Russia who suffered from severe hysteria, was taken to a mental hospital for treatment. There she met Carl, a young and talented psychiatrist inspired by Sigmund's work. Impressed by Sigmund's psychoanalytic methods, Carl decided to apply the approach in treating Sabina. This method involved long and honest conversations between the psychologist and the patient. During their first session, Sabina revealed that she felt like she was losing control over her own body due to the constant abuse she had endured. She even frequently had nightmares about her father's hands. After the session, Carl shared his first impressions of Sabina with his wife, Emma. However, Emma seemed more focused on her pregnancy and her hopes of having a baby boy. During their second session, Sabina began talking about her dreams and some strange events that had occurred in her life. Carl, who was generally skeptical of mystical things, was shocked when Sabina suddenly removed her robe. Although Carl helped her put it back on, the incident left her frightened. A few days later, Carl had to leave for work. In his absence, Sabina started exhibiting unstable behavior. She did things like playing with food and taking mud baths to get the hospital staff's attention. Eventually, she was forced to take a bath to calm her down. When Carl returned, he visited Sabina and offered to work with her. His wife Emma also became involved in the therapy process as an assistant. Sabina showed great interest and talent in psychiatry. She even managed to create a psychological profile of Emma and realized that Emma was Carl's wife. A few weeks later, Emma gave birth to a baby girl. She apologized to Carl for not being able to give him a son. Even though Carl lived in luxury thanks to Emma, he felt that something was missing because he did not have a son. In the following sessions, Sabina began talking about her strange dreams and mystical creatures. She also admitted that physical punishment actually awakened desire within her. Since childhood, she had felt pleasure from punishment and always sought ways to experience it again. 2 years later, Carl traveled to Austria to meet Sigmund in person. He discussed Sabina's case with him and received valuable advice. Sigmund, who tended to interpret everything through a specific lens, offered a different perspective from Carl's. Carl believed that humans were driven not only by desire, but also by fear, anger, and other emotions. At night, Carl shared his secrets and dreams with Sigmund. Sigmund always provided logical explanations, convincing Carl that it was the only right way. However, Carl felt that Sabina was the only person who truly understood him. By then, Sabina was no longer his patient. She was studying at a university to become a psychologist and had a promising future. Carl deeply valued her opinions, as she believed that not everything could be reduced to a single cause. Sigmund later wrote a letter to Carl, asking him to take care of Otto, a former student of Sigmund's. Otto was a brilliant specialist, but was overly obsessed with his hedonistic lifestyle. He often talked about entertainment and had many lovers. Otto even suggested that Carl pursue a relationship with Sabina, though Carl refused. The story of Sabina and Carl illustrates the complexity of the relationship between a patient and a therapist, as well as how life experiences and human emotions can influence the healing process and self-understanding. At their next meeting, Sabina realized that she couldn't be a good psychologist. Without hesitation, she approached Carl and asked him to visit her whenever he wanted to continue their close relationship. Carl, confused by the situation, decided to consult his patient, Otto, to understand whether he should break medical ethics or not. Otto, known for being laid back and unconcerned with rules, instead convinced Carl that with someone as beautiful as Sabina, time should be spent on more enjoyable things rather than just talking about psychology. Not long after, Otto managed to resolve his own issues in a rather extreme way. He engaged in various activities with a nurse, then stole a ladder and escaped from the psychiatric clinic. Inspired by Otto's advice, Carl finally decided to visit Sabina. He began to realize that Sabina had certain tendencies that made their time together more exciting and diverse. Years passed, and Carl's family moved into a new countryside home. Emma, Carl's wife, couldn't imagine life without her husband. In fact, she gifted him a yacht with red sails. Though Emma suspected that Carl might have a mistress, she chose to endure the betrayal to keep the family together. Her words ended up influencing Carl's moral principles. He decided to end his relationship with Sabina. However, Sabina wasn't ready to give up. She even humiliated herself just to maintain the right to stay friends with Carl. She allowed Carl to be harsh and cruel to her, as long as they remained close. It was as if she couldn't let go of the emotional bond that had formed between them. Sometime later, Carl and Sigmund met again to share their views on psychology. Sigmund remained convinced that all complexes and mental illnesses were linked to past experiences and their interpretations. Meanwhile, Carl began to notice strange details in human life. He became increasingly interested in the idea that coincidences were actually patterns that the human mind couldn't fully comprehend. Carl started focusing on emotions, dreams, in the mystical aspects of life. Sigmund, on the other hand, felt uncomfortable with Jung's bold theories. He worried that the field of psychology couldn't rely on just one approach and feared that his reputation would be ruined if Jung's theories were deemed unscientific. This fear made Sigmund more rigid and resistant to Carl's ideas. Frustrated, Carl ended up taking out his anger on Sabina, who remained loyal and willing to fulfill any of Carl's desires. Despite attempts at reconciliation, Carl and Sigmund's relationship remained strained. They tried working together by handling new patients and reaching a common diagnosis, but their differences became more apparent. One day during a yacht trip, Sigmund told Carl that he had received a letter containing information about Carl's relationship with Sabina. Carl denied the accusations, but the fear of being exposed for his behavior led him to end things with Sabina for good. A few days later, it was revealed that the provocative letters sent to Sigmund and Sabina's parents were actually written by Emma. Carl's wife had done it deliberately to prevent him from falling deeper into the affair. Not long after, Sabina returned to Carl, but this time as a fellow psychotherapist. She needed Carl's help because her parents still believed she was mentally unstable and had arranged for her therapy sessions to continue. After paying for her appointment, Sabina started involving Sigmund in a certain game. She told him details about her meetings with Carl, which made Sigmund uncomfortable. Not wanting to get involved in Carl's personal matters, Sigmund asked Carl to handle his own problems. In their correspondence, Sabina eventually received a harsh response from Sigmund. She realized that she had to forget her relationship with Carl and try to move on with her life without being tied to a complicated past. Some time later, Sabina begged Carl to write a letter to Sigmund. She wanted him to explain the truth about their relationship because she hoped to become Sigmund's patient. However, instead of doing so, Carl and Sigmund traveled to America together to explore new horizons in psychology. During the trip, Carl kept telling Sigmund about his strange dreams and urged his mentor to be more open about his personal experiences. But Sigmund was too afraid that revealing such things would damage his reputation. He chose to keep his dreams a secret, which eventually led to a serious argument between them. Carl began to feel that Sigmund was no longer his teacher or inspiration. Their views on psychology were becoming more different, and Carl felt that Sigmund's approach was too narrow. Meanwhile, in 1910, Sabina successfully graduated and became a skilled psychologist. She started questioning Sigmund's theories, believing that they were not only flawed, but also contradictory. Sabina was ready to consider human issues from a completely different perspective, which could threaten Sigmund's reputation as a leading psychotherapist. According to Sabina, human relationships were not just about self-destruction or self-preservation. They could also create something more beautiful than just individual personalities. Carl, listening to her thoughts, became deeply intrigued by her new ideas. Not long after, Sabina decided to leave her husband and return to Austria. In 1912, Sabina finally met Sigmund in person. During their meeting, she openly criticized and dismantled his entire philosophy. Not long after, Carl also met with Sigmund and criticized him. These criticisms deeply hurt Sigmund's pride, even causing him to collapse to the floor and nearly faint. He felt devastated, as if the world he had built was beginning to crumble. The relationship between Sigmund and Carl worsened. They continued arguing through letters, as their worldviews and approaches to psychology had completely diverged. They could no longer find common ground. In 1913, while pregnant, Sabina visited Carl's home and met his wife, Emma. Carl was happy that his former patient now had a family, but at the same time, he felt sad knowing that the child Sabina was carrying wasn't his. She was the only person Carl had truly loved, and those feelings still lingered. During their conversation, Carl shared a nightmare he had about a bloody avalanche covering all of Europe. Sabina didn't fully understand the meaning of his dream, though she linked it to mysticism. Not long after that meeting, she returned to Russia.